negotiations on border security funding. Here's a look at some of that 45-minute debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Today we are considering a continuing resolution to reopen the Department of Homeland Security after a funding lapse that is now 33 days and counting. This bill simply extends 2018 funding until February 28th with no new funding anomalies. The only new priorities in the CR authorize the department to provide back pay to reimburse personnel and state or other federal grantees consistent with prior precedent following a lapse in appropriations. Mr. Speaker, there are only two approaches to take. Either we reopen the department and the rest of the federal government without conditions, or we continue to use federal workers and everyone who depends on them as bargaining chips in funding negotiations. It seems to me the choice is straightforward. I hope my friends on the other side of the aisle will reconsider the necessity of opening up the government and paying federal employees without any preconditions. There have been a number of funding lapses over the last few decades, all ill-considered, all harmful to our country, our economy, and our federal workforce. History has shown that the American people do not approve of using the federal government and workforce as pawns in a legislative chess game. The side that has tried to use a shutdown as leverage in a negotiation has routinely failed, and polling shows that this recent iteration of the shutdown is no exception. I know my friends on the other side of the aisle have criticized the consideration of clean CRs on the basis that the Senate will not pass them and the President will not sign them. Mr. Speaker, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, I would say that change is to reopen the government To my friends on the other side of the aisle, I would say that in order to change that, it is to open the Department of Homeland Security by having every member of the minority party support the CR. This possibly could help change the thinking of the Senate majority when it votes on reopening the entire government later today, and perhaps even change the thinking of the President. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves her time. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in very strong opposition to the joint resolution. Before I do that, I wish to thank our full ranking member, Ms. Granger from Texas, my dear friend and colleague, for allowing me to chair this important subcommittee and for allowing me to manage this time today. I also would like to acknowledge my friend and colleague from the other side of the aisle, Ms. Roybal Allard, who I look forward to working with over the next 2 years. She, in her capacity as chair of the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, and me in my role as ranking member, highest member of the Republican Party on that subcommittee. I also see my friend Ms. Lowy from New York, the full chairman, here as well. How did we get here? Ladies and gentlemen, the fiscal year that the government operates on started in September. It runs from September to September. So it started in the 115th Congress. The Appropriations Committee, of which I'm very proud and thankful to be a member of, is a very special committee. And for those who are watching us now, I would offer, and I've said time and time again, the Appropriations Committee is something special. I'm the only member on the Appropriations Committee from my great state of Tennessee. And I admire every member in this House and the positions and the committees they serve on. But the Appropriations Committee is a problem-solving committee. It's a committee that funds things, funds the government on the discretionary side, including Homeland Security. During the course of the debate during this long and arduous shutdown, and let me say this, To the men and women who are working all across this nation without pay, thank you. I sympathize with you, not empathize, but sympathize. This is wrong. About 24% of the government is shut down, and that is never a good situation for us to be in as a nation. And that is why we must come up with a cure that will work. Something that will pass the House, something that will pass the other chamber. And I may add today, as we debate this bill and as I oppose this bill, in the other chamber, the United States Senate is debating bills. I would submit that the solution could and should come from the United States House of Representatives. And that solution is plain and simple. The American people want and deserve border security. The American people want and desire a barrier. Call it a wall, call it a fence. It is something that the American people want. It has been proven, whether in San Diego, El Paso, and other jurisdictions, that these walls do work. But regardless where we stand on that issue, I support the President's position. The President has made it very clear that he is not going to sign a bill that does not include border security with a wall or an analogous vehicle to a wall. So if we keep coming back to the table, even with the best intentions, even with the best passions, even with the best hopes to help get the government open and running again and protect our borders, and I do believe members on both sides of this aisle and in the other chamber, and of course in the White House, want border security, want our country kept safe. The humanitarian crisis is outrageous. Women and children are being abused. Drugs are pouring in. But above all else, we need to secure our southern borders. We need to keep the American people safe. The cure lay in a compromise. The cure ought to come from this body, and if our friends in the majority would see fit to put a sufficient number on the table as part of a compromise. Think of the boldness and courage of our president, who stood up and basically said, I will come up with a cure for DACA, a solution on DACA. That's courage, that's leadership, that's boldness. And I think that's what the American people deserve. Let us today make a resolve that this great house, this great people's house, which I believe is closest to the people, we're elected every 2 years. And think about it, the fiscal year, ladies and gentlemen, is going to end in September. We are going to be back replaying this same argument again, this same debate again in just a few weeks. Come up with a solution that we can all work with. That means a wall, that means other areas of border security, that means full funding of the government. And again, I close by saying to all of those who are working without pay, whether it's in our great Coast Guard, the TSA, to the contractors who are hurting, I will continue to work hard to come to a compromise with my party, with my colleagues, to come to a conclusion of this national nightmare. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Ms. Roybal Allard.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute. I would just like to point out to the minority that there are billions of dollars in border security in this continuing resolution. And I agree that we need to open up the government. And while the President refuses to do so, our homeland is every day getting more vulnerable to our security and lack of security. And I hope that the President recognizes that and that he opens up the government so then that we can have a real discussion on border security. And now I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Lowy, the chairwoman of the full Appropriations Committee.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Trump shutdown is now in its 34th day. Yesterday, the House passed 6 bills to reopen most of the government. And with this bill today, we can reopen the entire government while providing time to negotiate a full-year bill for the Department of Homeland Security. This continuing resolution would ensure that the Department of Homeland Security is open and its public servants, including Secret Service agents, transportation security officers, Border Patrol, custom officers, and the brave men and women of the Coast Guard are paid for their work. According to the New York Times, as many as 1 of every 10 transportation security officers are not coming to work. Frankly, they can't simply afford to. As a result, some of our busiest airports are deploying backup and reserve workers. Other airports have closed checkpoints and entire terminals. Notwithstanding the long lines for travelers, this reduction in staffing puts our transportation security workforce on the brink and could risk national security. Additionally, 41,000 active duty service members and 2,100 civilians in the Coast Guard are working without pay. No one should have to face the uncertainty of not knowing when they'll get paid, especially the men and women of our armed forces. Each week of the Trump shutdown cost the United States economy $1.2 billion. Instead of continuing down this wasteful road, I urge my friends on the other side of the aisle, reopen the government, pay our federal workers, and then we can work together in a bipartisan way to determine the most effective border security. But we must open the government. Make no mistake, I want to make it very clear. Democrats support smart investments in our homeland security, including increased infrastructure investments at our ports of entry, advanced technology to scan for contraband, new technology for detecting unauthorized crossings. We can work together to meet these needs. There's no question in my mind, because we've worked together in a bipartisan way for many years. If we sat down together, we can work out answers to these questions that could be supported by both sides of the aisle. But frankly, my friends, until the government is open, the president's actions are hurting hardworking families and putting our security and economy at risk. We are appropriators. We know how to work together in a bipartisan way. Frankly, it's not that difficult. The facts are there. We've all got many, many briefings on the best way to secure our borders. And by the way, drugs have been mentioned. The facts are that 90% of the drugs are coming through of the ports of entry. We can work this out. But to keep the government open and to see thousands of people suffering, not being able to support their families, is just unconscionable. So let's open the government. Let's sit down. Let's get to work. Let's resolve this now. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time to Ms. Granger, the ranking member on the full Appropriations Committee, as she may wish to consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized for as much time as she may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to House Joint Resolution 31. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a true humanitarian and security crisis on our southern border. Listen to this. In the month of December alone, Border Patrol agents apprehended more than 50,000 individuals on our southern border. Of those, a record-breaking 27,518 were family units. Nearly 5,000 of them were unaccompanied children. Due in part to the treacherous journey, Border Patrol refers approximately 50 individuals a day for medical treatment. In 1 week alone, at the end of December, they referred 451 people to medical providers for treatment. Of those, 259 were children. 7 out of 10 people are victims of violence on their journey to the southern border. 31% of women are sexually assaulted. There's been a significant increase in drugs like methamphetamines, heroin, fentanyl coming across the border. Unfortunately, this is a crisis partly of our own making. For years, members of both sides of the aisle have warned against the growing threats posed by our failure to enforce and reform our nation's immigration laws. Just this week, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said, "We want border security. We want to make sure that people who come into the United States of America are authorized to do so, and we know they come in. We don't want contraband. We don't want drugs coming in. We don't want people, dangerous people, coming into our country, so we're for border security." Given this, we would think that they would be jumping at the chance to vote for a bill that includes provisional status for 3 years for 700,000 current DACA recipients, giving them access to work permits, Social Security numbers, and protection from deportation, gives them provisional status for 3 years for 300,000 immigrants whose current temporary protected status is set to expire. $805 million for technology, canines, and personnel to help stop the flow of illegal drugs, weapons, and other contraband. $800 million in humanitarian assistance, medical support, and new temporary housing. $782 million to hire an additional 2,750 border agents, law enforcement, and staff. $563 million to support our immigration court system, including hiring 75 new immigration judge teams to reduce the immigration court backlog of 800,000 cases. All of this was included in the reasonable compromise that President Trump put forward over the weekend. But that's not the bill we have before us. Not only did House Democrats reject this plan before they'd even heard the details, the bill they put on the floor today provides not one single reform for our broken immigration system. All this bill does is extend the status quo. Mr. Speaker, I've been to the border more times than I can count. I've talked to these families who are risking their lives and the lives of their children to come here. I've heard the stories of Americans whose family members' lives were cut short due to drugs and bad actors who seek to exploit our immigration system. We owe it to all of these families to do something about this crisis, and I call on my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to end the political games. It's past time for them to come to the negotiating table and work to resolve this crisis in a reasonable, meaningful way, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The gentlewoman from California,
Yes.
Ms. Roybal Allard.
I yield myself 30 seconds. Mr. Speaker, for whatever reason, there seems to be a reluctance on the part of the minority to accept the facts. And the reality is, while there has been an increase in drugs crossing the border, the vast majority of drug interdictions have occurred at the ports of entry, not between the ports of entry. In FY 2018, only 3% of all heroin was interdicted between the ports, and only 5.8% of the meth was interdicted between the ports. I give myself another 30 seconds.
Gentlewoman is
The remainder
recognized.
of the interdictions were at the ports of entry, along with a small amount at CBP checkpoints north of the ports of entry. So this idea that somehow we need to have this wall between the ports of entry because of the fact that drugs are coming through that area at large numbers and contributing to the drug problems that we have here is absolutely false. And now it's my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Chairwoman Roybal-Allard for her leadership on Homeland Security and for her ideas on how we secure the border. I also want to thank the ranking member, my friend from Tennessee also, and of course the full committee ranking woman, Kay Ranger, also for the work that she's done. Of course, our leader, Ms. Laurie, also for our chairman of the full committee. I rise in support of this resolution to reopen the government of Homeland Security. As we've said all along, we must first open up the government and we can negotiate. We've always done that. We've always keep the government open and then we negotiate. And then we're doing this so the federal employees do not suffer. It's been 34 days since the government shut down, and far surpassing any other previous record. That means 34 days that 800 federal employees have not received pay. I live on the border. I don't just go and visit the border. I drink the water. I breathe the air. I talk to Border Patrol agents almost every day. I talk to CBP officers every day. I talk to TSA officers. I talk to other folks. And they are doing absolutely critical work to keep us safe, but not receiving a salary. Open up the government. Imagine trying to patrol the border or keep airline passengers safe without receiving a single dime for the last 34 days. You might be concerned, you might be concerned about not being able to pay your mortgage, your payment, your car payment, food, medicine, your kids are going to school. That's what's going through those federal employees at the border. I've talked to them. And we need to make sure that we open up the government. Now, the American public is ready for President Trump to put an end on this crippling shutdown. Yet, let's keep the facts in mind. The president continues to reject any sort of compromise. We're ready. We're appropriators. We can sit down and work this out. I know we can. We've done it in the past. And what I want to make sure is that we don't hold the federal employees hostage for a 14th century solution to a 21st century issue that we're looking at. In Texas, we have natural barriers. Now, look at this. In West Texas, you got probably over 100 feet of barriers up there. These are the natural barriers. Tell me how somebody's going to cross this. Tell me how somebody's going to cross this natural barriers that we have. Or if you look at the southern part of Texas, you have a river. Private property rights are important. We got to make sure. Now, you tell me how this river crossover. You're going to put a wall here and cut off people from their property that they own so long. How are you going to do this? All I need is a $100 ladder to cross that particular, or you can dig under the tunnel. Listen to the latest drug case in New York. What are the bad guys saying there? They can either go under through a tunnel, they can use a catapult, they can use a ladder, they can use other things. We want to make sure that we secure the border. I live in the border. I want to make sure we secure the border, but let's do it the right way. Now, if you want to stop people from coming in, remember 67% of the people that are here illegally, how do they come here? Through a legal visa. So even if you put a wall, they're going to fly over, they're going to drive to a bridge, or they're going to go ahead and come through a ship. And keep in mind, most of this visa overstay, you know where they're from? Canada. Canada. Now, I'm not asking you to look at the northern border and put a wall, but I'm saying Canadians, look at the facts itself. So if you want to stop drugs, just like the chairwoman said, DEA, CBP, the drug threat assessment, they will tell you that most drugs will come in through ports of entry, either in car compartments, either in trucks, either in trains, other ways. So even if you put a wall, they're going to go in. So what do? Is we got to make sure that we put K-9s at our bridges, make sure we have enough CBP officers, make sure we have X-ray machines. I mean, look at Laredo, my hometown. We get 15,000 trailers a day. 15,000 trailers a day. We need to put technology there. We need to put K-9. We need to put CBP officers to make sure that we work on securing our border. Now, everybody talks about a crisis. 2001, we had about 1.6 million individuals at Border Patrol stop. Now it's what, 398,000? Look what happened. The numbers have gone down. And if you want to talk about the safety of our security, I will tell you that my hometown of Laredo is about 3-4 times safer than we are here in Washington, D.C. Murder rates, assaults, rapes, name all the violent crimes, it's safer here. So the most dangerous things that I do.
Expired.
Okay. I yield to the gentleman 2 more minutes.
Gentlemen, yield an additional 2 minutes.
That I do when I'm on the border is when I leave the border to come to Washington, D.C. I'm not talking about the politics. I'm talking about it's more violent here. So what should we do? Let's open up the government. Let's sit down, advocate for 21st century solutions, technology, increased personnel. We're losing more Border Patrol. What do? What does the administration do? They put a $297 million contract to show them how to hire Border Patrol. They just put out a $14.8 million payment to hire two Border Patrol for almost $15 million, increase personnel, increase the infrastructure at the ports of entry, increase immigration judges. We've been increasing immigration judges for the last 3 years. Come on, this is nothing new. We've been doing that. And again, one of the most important things, do we play defense on the 1-yard line where we spend $18 billion at the U.S. border, or do we play defense on the 20-yard line, which is working with the southern part of Mexico, where we put $80 million a couple years ago. And what happened? They started stopping 220,000 individuals a year. A lot of people that are coming in, and put money in Central America, which we've done before, to do that. So again, given the facts, I just call upon our friends, open up the government, let's negotiate. We're appropriators. I feel very confident that if we open up the government, we sit down, we'll find a solution. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Adderholt.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the ranking member for yielding. I rise this morning to speak in opposition to the majority's temporary funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security. However, our crisis that we're at this point and at our border is not temporary, and it continues to grow during this government shutdown. I'm not sure why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will expect a different outcome today when the real solution, as we all know, starts when everyone sits around the negotiating table. The people elected the president, and they elected each of us. They elected each of us to do our job, and this is a serious job, and legislating is governing, not putting bills on the floor of the House that we know the president will veto. As he has continued to say that he will veto this legislation, and we know what the outcome will be. I think all of the political points have been made here this morning. And I believe that it's time that we put partisanship aside to try to work together to try to find a solution. And instead of using the word coming together to compromise, I think we should use a better word to say we need to find common ground. Just saying no to the physical infrastructure is not really a negotiating position. This House yesterday had the opportunity to vote for pay for federal workers who have missed their paychecks. And it's disappointing that together as a Congress, we couldn't come together for the needs of these public servants. We must put this political gamesmanship aside and seek to work together to find some common ground. And I think that's where the solution lies. The solution really is simple. One side does not win at the expense of the other. Instead, what we need to do is find a way where each side cannot put our individual party's interest before the needs of the country and the people who serve this country. So this morning, as we debate this legislation and continue to have this legislation before us, I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and let me say that, both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, to reject the proposal so that we can get back to some serious business of being a legislative body. And let's show that the American people that we deserve the trust that they placed in us when they sent us to serve in this House of Representatives. And at that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlewoman from California.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Speaker, ask to address the House, advise and extend. Let me thank the gentlelady from California for her years of service, pointed service, recognized service, for we have gone to the southern border many, many times. I am a resident of the southern border. I am committed to the people of the southern border as I am to the people of the United States, and most importantly, to the heroic workers who work for the federal government. First, let me say that any regular order or business of this House should be the opening of the government and paying the workers now. I have been alongside of every aspect of the southern border, every state, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. I have been to every part of the southern border. I have seen the terrain. I have gone up to the Rio Grande and on the Rio Grande several times. I've seen it at its fullest and I've seen it at its most narrow. I've seen tunnels. I have seen the San Diego wall, if you will. I have seen the steel fencing. I have spoken to Border Patrol agents alongside of the border. The tragedy of young Felipe, who passed away, I went to the part where he walked up with his father and they presented themselves to the Border Patrol. And my colleagues, including the General Chair Lady, have likewise walked with me or been to the border many, many times. They have solutions. And so regular order now seems to be a straw man. We are placing on the floor of the House a bill that will open the government until February 28th, but it will fund Homeland Security. May I say those words again? Homeland Security. We are sitting here today, and we are not considering that our Homeland Security Department, one of the largest, I believe second to defense, rightly so, because it's Homeland Security, which I've had the privilege of serving since the heinous terrorist act of 9/11. And I've never given up this committee because it's close to my heart. It means the protection of the American people. Day by day, they look to now, post 9/11, we have a Homeland Security Department. And the leaders of that department, all of them who I've worked with, most recently, Secretary Kelly, formerly the Chief of Staff of this White House, and John Jay, have said in a letter, open the government, you will begin to see the unraveling.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
The unraveling, may I have more time?
I yield 2 more minutes.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 2 additional minutes.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady and I thank the Speaker. It's unraveling. TSO officers make $28,000. Every one of you are going to see them going out and coming back in. You're counting on air traffic controllers to keep the planes afloat. You're counting on pilots and flight attendants to be there pursuant to the aviation system. I have been hearing pilots and airlines talking about putting pilots on layoff, if you will, because they're frightened about the planes and they may have to shut down some of the routes. This is a ripple effect. The Smithsonian system is crumbling. $4 million. They cannot afford one more day. But I want to get back to our TSOs and all of those line officers, the DEAs, the ATFs, the FBIs, under the DOJ, not funded, even though essential and working. And so why not take this bill that covers Secret Service? And I hope the President's acquiescence and calm tweet announcement of acknowledging that you cannot have a State of the Union when the government is in collapse and there's no state of a union, and that we will not have one, sadly, because we do work together. I am saying pass the bill, my good friends. Vote. My good friends on this side of the aisle, the Republicans, you're going to vote no on a Homeland Security bill on the pretense of regular business. The lives of TSAs, one young TSA had to send her newborn baby to her mother because she could not afford to take care of that child. They don't have gas money, and they're not allowed to take enormous gifts. And every time I travel, there they are, the frontline people of this government in the system that is most attractive to terrorists. That is airplanes. They have never moved away from that. So I'm asking my colleagues to realize the importance of this bill that will open the government to fund the reopen the Department of Homeland Security, allowing these employees to be paid, and begin us on the process of opening government and paying our workers. God help us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as members on both sides of the aisle can clearly show, that today has been a day of speeches, of passion, and good faith beliefs on both sides of the aisle. I want the American people to know that the people making these arguments on both sides of the aisle have bona fide ideas about how to get the government open, how to keep us safe, and how to move forward from this very difficult position. In my prior profession, I was an attorney. I was an attorney for 24 years. And in my closing arguments, oftentimes, I would point to the facts that were most beneficial to my case and to my clients. But there was a vehicle that came up while I was practicing. It was called mediation. And mediation was a way that the parties could come to the table and all get something and all give something in return. We have heard the same broken cure come from the majority since they became the majority. That cure, albeit in their view, their version of how to move forward, will not work. The practical constraints will require an agreement that the House, the Senate, and the White House all can agree on. That is the practical reality. We agree that the hardworking men and women of the Coast Guard and TSA and the contractors are suffering, and we've got to stop that suffering. But when we know that the vote today, which I will oppose with my vote on behalf of my constituents, when we know that that will not work, we have got to come back to the table with something that will work, to continue to press for something that will not reopen the government, will not get our task done. And again, I stress the fact that we are going to end this fiscal year in September of this year. In a few short weeks, when we move past this crisis, we're going to, in our respective subcommittees, and there are 12 on the great Appropriations Committee, including this great subcommittee of Homeland Security, Ms. Roybal Allard and I will be debating this again. And I thank her for her hard work in these difficult times. This is fraying on me. This is fraying on our friends in the majority. This is fraying on our staffs, on the American people. But the solution is clear. give the American people funds for a border wall as part of an overall compromise to get border security, to get the government open, and yes, to look at other ways to keep our southern border and the American people safe. So my no vote today is not a no vote just to say no. My no vote today is a statement to say to our friends in the majority, as well-intentioned as they may be, and I can stress to my colleagues that we, on the minority side, are well-intentioned. It's not about good faith or bad faith. It's about bona fide differences. But the American people elect us to lead. Our great republic is not an easy way to govern. But, Mr. Speaker, I would submit it is the best way to govern. Now, I know that's hard right now for some people not getting a paycheck to understand. But in our great republic, it takes 2 houses of Congress. It takes an executive, a president, and yes, it takes the Supreme Court as well. So with that, I will close in opposition. I will close with the best intentions. And I just implore, I plea with my friends in the majority, put something on the table that will fund border security, that will give us a wall, that will give us a barrier where it works, and we will open the government and keep the American people safe. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back all his time. The gentlewoman from California.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, let me just first say that it's very disappointing to hear from the minority that the first priority is not to stop the suffering of our federal workers by opening up the government. It is also unfortunate that the President has created such ill will around border security and border barriers in particular. He has truly poisoned the well on this issue and made it much more difficult for Congress to find common ground. And as a result, our federal workers are suffering and our homeland is becoming less safe. Mr. Speaker, it is time to end the shutdown. This morning, we can begin the process by voting to reopen the Department of Homeland Security. Then we can continue to fulfill our responsibility by finishing our work on the full year 2019 funding bill for the department so that those who protect our homeland can be paid as they continue their critical mission of protecting our homeland. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her remaining time. All time for debate has expired.
The government shutdown is now in its 34th